presents The Giants of Philosophy, narrated by Charlton Heston. This is tape number 1 on Aristotle. Aristotle, probably more than anyone else, shaped our Western intellectual traditions. Several centuries after his death, he dominated intellectual life in the Greco-Roman world. During the collapse of the Roman Empire, his works were lost in much of Europe. They were preserved and studied only in centers of learning in the Arabic world. Since his writings were rediscovered in Western Europe in the 12th century, Aristotle has been familiar to every liberally educated person. Much of what he wrote more than 2,300 years ago still rings true today. Even when Aristotle appears to be mistaken about something, what he says is invariably subtle, complex, and interesting. Diogenes Laertius, an ancient biographer, lists over 150 works attributed to Aristotle. Even a cursory reading of this list will reveal the breathtaking scope of his interests. He answered virtually every important philosophical question that's ever been conceived by the human mind. We shouldn't be surprised, then, to learn that St. Thomas Aquinas referred to Aristotle simply as the philosopher. Dante called him the master of those who know. And the historian Will Durant has said,
2,000 years have changed merely the incidentals of Aristotle's logic. His creation of this new discipline of thought and his firm establishment of its essential lines remains among the lasting achievements of the human mind.
Aristotle lived much of his life in Athens, though he was never an Athenian citizen. He was born in 384 BC in Stagira, a small city in remote northern Greece. The Peloponnesian War, Athens' disastrous war with Sparta, had been over for only 20 years. Socrates had been executed by the Athenian people for practicing philosophy only 15 years earlier. And Plato, who was in his mid-40s, had just founded his academy in Athens. Little can be known of Aristotle's childhood. Diogenes Laertius provides only a brief account.
Aristotle was the son of Nicomachus and Phaestis. His father, Nicomachus, resided with Amyntas, the king of Macedonia, and served as his physician and friend.
Aristotle was probably orphaned when he was still quite young. He was raised by a beneficent guardian in the court of King Amyntas. At the age of 17, Aristotle was sent to Athens to finish his education at Plato's academy. Diogenes Laertius tells us that Aristotle was not only brilliant, he was also somewhat vain. He provides us with a terse physical description.
He was the most knowledgeable of Plato's students. He had a lisp, slender thighs, small eyes, and was conspicuous on account of his dress, his rings, and his hair.
Aristotle stayed at the academy for 20 years, first as a student, then as an instructor. We simply can't say how much personal interest Plato took in his brilliant student or how Aristotle responded, but this much is clear. Aristotle's philosophy is deeply indebted to Plato. This is evident throughout his writings, even in the works we think were his last. But ironically, Aristotle would later severely criticize many of the basic tenets of Plato's philosophy. In 348 BC, Aristotle left the academy. He was 35 and was not to return to what had been his home for 2 decades. According to Diogenes Laertius,
Aristotle left the academy when Plato was still alive. Hence, they say, Plato remarked, Aristotle rejects us, just as a colt kicks at the mother who bore him.
Other ancient sources suggest that Aristotle left in anger when he learned that Plato had willed the presidency of the academy to his nephew, Speusippus. Aristotle considered Speusippus to be his intellectual inferior. But whatever the truth of this claim, Aristotle, along with his companion Hermias and a small group of former students of the academy, left Athens to settle in Asia Minor. Today, that's the western coast of Turkey. About 343 BC, Philip, the ruler of Macedon, invited Aristotle to tutor his 13-year-old son. This child would later be known to the world as Alexander the Great. Plutarch, the Roman biographer, describes this relationship.
Alexander not only received his ethical and political teachings, but also his oral teachings, fit only for the serious thinker. For when Alexander had crossed into Asia and learned that he had published these doctrines in books, he wrote him a letter on behalf of philosophy, which is now repeated. Alexander wishes Aristotle well, but you did not do well in publishing your oral doctrines. For in what shall I surpass others, if the doctrines about which I have been educated will be held in common by all men?
Other ancient sources tell us that Alexander, knowing of Aristotle's love of anatomy, had specimens shipped to him from the far reaches of his empire. Yet we can never really know how much to rely on these stories about the relationship between Aristotle and his famous pupil. In 335 BC, Alexander became ruler of the Macedonian Empire. In little more than a decade, his empire encompassed an area stretching from present-day Italy in the west, through Persia in the Middle East, all the way to India's western border. Also, in 335 BC, Aristotle returned to Athens. Only this time, he didn't make the academy his home. Instead, he established a rival school in rented buildings just outside the walls of Athens, in an area known as the Lyceum. There, Aristotle conducted his research, wrote, and lectured his students. His lectures, according to the Roman biographer Aulus Gellius, were divided into two types: the public or exoteric lectures and the oral or acroatic lectures. W.K.C. Guthrie, the great British historian of philosophy, has quoted Aulus in describing these lectures.
The name exoteric was applied to rhetoric, the cultivation of a quick wit, and education in civics. Acroatic, on the other hand, were the works concerned with more arcane and exact philosophy. In the Lyceum, he devoted the mornings to the acroatic subjects and did not allow anyone to attend without assuring himself of their ability, educational grounding, keenness to learn, and willingness to work. The exoteric lectures and speech classes he held in the same place in the evening and opened them to any young men without restriction. This he called the evening walk, the other the early one, since in both he walked as he talked.
If this account's at all correct, we can understand why, even centuries later, Aristotle was called the peripatetic, after the Greek word for walking around. News of Alexander's death reached Athens in 323 BC, and the Athenians, always lovers of democracy, quickly revolted against their Macedonian rulers. Aristotle had strong Macedonian ties, so he became a personal target of anti-Macedonian sentiment. He was promptly indicted on a trumped-up charge of impiety. Aristotle, his accusers charged, had committed blasphemy. Rather than stand trial, Aristotle left Athens and returned to northern Greece, where he'd been born. His choice to leave, of course, stands in direct contrast to Socrates' earlier decision to remain in Athens when he faced his accusers and drank poison at their command. As one ancient biographer tells us, perhaps apocryphally, Aristotle defended his decision to leave rather than stand trial, saying that he was preventing the Athenians from sinning twice against philosophy. Within a year of leaving Athens, Aristotle was dead at the age of 63. Diogenes hints that he may have committed suicide by drinking hemlock, driven to despair by the turn of events against him. But there is evidence suggesting that he died of natural causes. He left a wife and 2 children. Aristotle's philosophy says we should practice moderation in all things. Yet one ancient critic said that Aristotle is moderate to excess. Many modern students of Aristotle are surprised to learn that ancient authors often praised his writings for their clarity, wit, and carefully crafted style. Almost no modern reader would be tempted to use such adjectives. What's come down to us under the name of Aristotle is to modernize, utterly opaque and devoid of humor. Perhaps Will Durant expressed it best.
We must not expect of Aristotle such literary brilliance as floods the pages of the dramatist philosopher Plato. Instead of giving us great literature in which philosophy is embodied and obscured in myth and imagery, Aristotle gives us science, technical, abstract, concentrated. If we go to him for entertainment, we shall sue for the return of our money.
To reconcile these different assessments of Aristotle's writing style, we should realize that ancient commentators were referring to what Aristotle wrote to be published. Much of this writing was in a form like Plato's dialogues, but all of these works, except for a few fragments, have been lost. In fact, we have only a fraction, maybe as little as 1/5 of the Aristotelian writings that were available in antiquity. The surviving works were almost certainly not intended for publication. They often appear to be sketchy lecture notes. Some of them actually may have been notes taken by students. Aristotle revised his lectures over the years, and both his original and his revised views probably were placed together in a manuscript by an ancient editor. As a result, we find different views expressed on a single topic, sometimes inside the space of just a few lines, and it's not always easy to tell which one represents Aristotle's final opinion about the matter. So we must study him without his original writings, but we need also to consider what Aristotle didn't have, because it makes his achievements all the more astounding. According to the 19th century German philosopher Edward Zeller,
Aristotle had to fix time without a watch, to compare degrees of heat without a thermometer, to observe the heavens without a telescope, and the weather without a barometer. Of all our mathematical, optical, and physical instruments, he possessed only the rule and compass, together with the most imperfect substitutes for some few others. Chemical analysis, correct measurements and weights, and a thorough application of mathematics to physics were unknown. The attractive force of matter, the law of gravitation, electrical phenomena, the conditions of chemical combination, pressure of air and its effects, the nature of light, heat, combustion, etc. In short, all the facts on which the physical theories of modern science are based were wholly, or almost wholly, undiscovered.
Before we discuss Aristotle's philosophy, we should consider how he conceived the relationship between philosophy and logic. For Aristotle, philosophy is an effort to use reason to find truth in a specific area of inquiry, such as ethics or theology. Logic, on the other hand, only deals with the ways in which we distinguish correct from incorrect reasoning. Logic, taken by itself, can't establish truth, and so it can't yield knowledge. Therefore, logic is not, strictly speaking, a part of philosophy. Nevertheless, philosophers must be sure their reasoning is correct, so Aristotle insists we must master logic before we begin to study philosophy. Aristotle's works on logic have traditionally been grouped together under the name the organon. Organon is a Greek term meaning instrument, and the word for instrument is used probably because logic's an indispensable tool in searching for knowledge. Aristotle's logical investigations are based on the theory of the syllogism, that is, a deductive argument which draws a conclusion from two premises. If we start with the two premises that all Greek philosophers seek knowledge, and Aristotle was a Greek philosopher, we can conclude that Aristotle sought knowledge. The theory of the syllogism is set forth in Aristotle's work, The Prior Analytics, one of the major works making up the organon. Here Aristotle defines a syllogism.
Reasoning in which, when something is assumed, something other than what is assumed follows with necessity from what is assumed. I mean by what is assumed that which causes something else to follow, and I mean by follows from that for which no external term is needed to make the conclusion necessary.